Hello, DrupalCon. My name is Steven. I'm with Smartling. I'm here to be with you and excited to be with you about a presentation to talk about the 5 things to know when localizing a Drupal website in 2022. I'm joined by Donovan from Smartling. He's one of our special guests. He's definitely a very powerful player here at Smartling and has helped deploy many of our Drupal customers. So he's a subject matter expert when it comes to the matter, and we're happy to have him join us. So Donovan, do you want to take a moment?
Sure, thank you, Stephen. Hi, I'm Donovan Dwyer. I'm a solution architect here at Smartling. My role is basically to help onboard our customers into the Smartling environment, help get set up with our Smartling solutions, translation software, and help get the ease of access to our system that our customers so desperately need. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Donovan. So let's start off a little bit about Smartling. So we are a translation company. We've been around for about 11 years, and we have 5 global offices, and we have 1,000+ customers, and some of the best named customers out there. It's one of the most exciting things I find in working for the company is there's always a new brand we're working with and something exciting going on. One of the things that drives this industry forward is the content. Enterprises are using content to engage with their users, and that causes a lot of need for translation because there's new users and new markets, and they're always trying to expand and capture more business. So translation naturally becomes very prominent and very busy and a lot of very complex to manage overall. So that's why we're in business. Simply our goal is to help the world translate their digital content and implement a seamless translation process for them. So we're excited to be here. Not every customer is going to today we're talking about translating Drupal sites, but every customer at some point also has other touch points where they're interacting with their users, and they need to translate that content as well. So we may help customers initially with a Drupal site or some sort of CMS site, but then we also help them translate their entire portfolio of content and digital assets, whether that's living in a knowledge base or in some other system like a social media. Various other platforms are used to create content, and we look to help our customers with all of those touch points and translate all of that content as needed. Moving forward here. So the 3 major challenges that we see with localization are going to be the enterprises. As they grow, it becomes a very complex process for them to manage. If you think about the amount of content a large organization may create, it's constantly changing. Even just in the source language, it's constantly changing. They're producing more content, they're engaging more users. And if you start to add in additional systems, additional authors, additional languages, especially languages, as you start to do that, this becomes more complex, and you can't do it manually anymore. A lot of companies start out doing this manually, exporting XML files or copying and paste something, translating and pasting it back in, but it becomes too cumbersome to manage, and you really need to switch to using software to help you manage the overall process. And that's really what we bring is a software and translation management system integrated with the Drupal plugin, enabling a seamless translation process. The other big thing here in the localization industry is that you have quality controls in a lot of other parts of your business, but around translation, it's really hard to gauge quality because there's no accepted standard across the board. And also every language is different. And so, as companies start to expand into new languages, they're not thinking about managing quality, like creating style guides and how they speak in each of these languages like they've done. They don't invest the same amount of time in these additional languages as they've done in their source language. So quality becomes, suffers. It becomes harder to manage and harder to gauge as you expand into these new languages. And then lastly, every part of the business today is really captured and analyzed and recorded and gauged to see how do you make improvements and what things can you cut and which things should you expand on to improve your business. And one of the things that's not captured very well is the translation operations. So there's many companies that do a good job with this, but holistically, it needs a lot of improvement, and there's a lot of room for innovation here. So what we are going to talk about today, that was a quick overview of Smartling. Specifically today, we're going to look at the Smartling Drupal connector and what it does. And, really the overview of it here is that we're working to, install this thing easily so that you can set up and start using it quickly. But then it needs to work well with all of the content that you are creating. So we rely upon TMGMT, which is the kind of standard application. We'll talk more about TMGMT here in a minute, but it integrates with TMGMT to leverage the existing capabilities that it provides, so we can already grab the specific content that is provided in Drupal. We also have customizable workflows where you can use, machine translations or human translations. You have real-time translation statuses of requested jobs that you've sent. You can look at their status anytime and understand what translation, when it's going to be completed, and start to gauge and plan accordingly. You have automatic translation, requesting and delivery. We can implement automation where it makes sense, and then also put in control steps where it makes sense not to automate. So you have a lot of flexibility on how you want to work. Visual context is a key piece to the translation process. We're going to talk about that today. It's basically enabling our linguists to see a live rendering of the site and see it in context and understand what they're really translating. Additionally, it supports Drupal 7, Drupal 8, and Drupal 9. And then let's move into the 5 things that we need to know. So when you're localizing your Drupal website, these are the 5 things we think you need to be thinking about right from the beginning. Is 1, TMGMT and Smartling. So you need to understand what TMGMT is, and then how does Smartling play well with that. And then you need to understand how to set up the module properly and the things that go into it. It's not super complex, but it's important that it's done right. And then paragraphs. So paragraphs are a very popular thing out in the Drupal, the Drupal community. We wanted to take a few minutes and talk about, how we've seen, customers use paragraphs and some of the things to consider around that. Visual context, I already mentioned, and then we have change management. We have, we think a big part of the process is not just, sending everything for translation once, but then, as it's changing and getting, frequently updated, how do you manage all of that day-to-day work and keeping up with the change? So we have tools in place to help with that. Now, maybe before we start this, I wanted to ask Donovan a question is, what do you think of these 5 things, in your interactions with your customers, Donovan? Maybe I'll throw you off here. What do you think are the most kind of important things here to consider of these 5?
Well, of these 5, I think the most important things to consider would be the relationship between TMGMT and Smartling. That's definitely important, as well as the setup process. Obviously, if you haven't set up the connector properly, can't get any translations done. Beyond that, I think change management and visual context come second, but they're definitely very important. That would be the hierarchy for me in terms of.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's good. You've obviously deployed way more customers than me, so good standpoint. So let's move forward and take a look at TMGMT here a little bit. So TMGMT is a translation management module for Drupal, and it's existed since the beginning of Drupal. As far as I've been working with Drupal, it's been there, and it allows users to. It really provides the multi-language functionality within Drupal. So this is what is allowing you to create and store the translations, interact with them, export them, and do all of the things you need to do to really facilitate an automated translation experience. You also have, the ability to track statuses, see the status of a job if it's been requested, those types of things. So TMGMT is like the standard in the Drupal industry that we have decided to build on top of, so that we can also take advantage of all the great things that they're doing without having to require us to build it as well. So really great partnership, and we've been working with them for a number of years, and working with their product is great. It allows us to enhance what they're doing and really kind of bring it full circle and make it a turnkey solution. Anything you want to add on that, Donovan?
Yeah, I think TMGMT is a very powerful tool. Basically, what it does is it enables the translation process in a Drupal environment in and of itself. It gives the ability to have translators in your Drupal environment provide alternate versions of your source content in different languages. So that's it's a very crucial first step in getting your environment translated and fully ready for multilingual purposes.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. So inside of TMGMT, I know that they use jobs, and this is basically the mechanism to grab some content from the Drupal site, batch it into a job, and send it for translation. And I know in the Smartling platform we also use jobs. So we have jobs that do a similar thing where you can batch work that's maybe been requested that lives in a project and batch that into a job and a container of work and send that. Can you describe to me how the two systems, the two job systems play together? Is it complex or is it pretty easy to understand? Maybe if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, it's super easy to understand. It's very straightforward. The idea is that TMGMT creates jobs in your Drupal environment. These jobs contain content that you want to request for translation. So these jobs are what the Smartling connector will use to create Smartling jobs in your Smartling project. It'll just take a one-to-one copy of that TMGMT job and bring it into Smartling, where you can get access to all of your Smartling functionalities, such as workflows, visual context, different linguists, vendors, cost estimates, things like that. And that one-to-one relationship allows you to functionally use your Drupal environment as an extension of your Smartling environment and vice versa. So it kind of just facilitates the communication between two environments and allows you to translate your Drupal environment seamlessly from within Drupal itself.
Yeah, and I would imagine you have two different teams in those environments, right? You have a Drupal team that's requesting translation, and then you have a translation team or a localization team that's processing the jobs that have been requested. So you have two teams in two different platforms, but they're able to speak a similar language or see the same names of the jobs because of this one-to-one mapping. So it makes it easy to communicate and collaborate, I would guess.
Yeah, it absolutely makes things super easy. If you want the teams to collaborate, they can collaborate as much as you need. But if you want to silo them off, make it so that your content editors and your translators, don't need to be together, working together in order to get your content translated. You can definitely facilitate this with your Smartling connector setup. So it's very configurable.
Great. Okay. So kind of pull this full circle. The TMGMT piece sits here inside of the Drupal platform. So in Drupal, you create your web content. TMGMT is a module that sits inside of there, allows you to enhance the site to be multilingual, interacting with the various content types inside of Drupal. And then we integrate with TMGMT. And when I say it allows us to send content from Drupal to the Smartling platform. So you'll have content owners and creators in Drupal making content, but then as you send the content, it goes into the Smartling platform where it's, a project manager will kick off a translation project. And that could be, any sort of human translation, professional grade translation, or a mix of machine translation and humans, or machine only. We see use cases for all of those various aspects. And ideally, we have people that work inside of the Smartling platform to facilitate the translation process, bring it to completion, and then the connector will recognize translations completed and auto-publish that if that's what you want to have happen, or just check it back into Drupal as a draft mode for somebody to review and publish. So that's really how the systems work together. TMG is the foundation, the plumbing for Drupal to enable the translation, and then Smartling is really just the high-scale translation process that you need to keep up with this major demand. The TMGMT piece alone only isn't enough because you're not able to use translation memory in there. You're not able to use glossary and style guides automatically. You're not able to drive flexible translation workflows or integrate with other places. So the translation management system is key to making this all kind of a turnkey solution here. Moving forward, Donovan's going to take a moment and talk through the setup parts and also the paragraphs part. So we'll turn the time over now to him. Go ahead, Donovan.
Thank you, Stephen. So I think the first thing in the setup process that's important to note is the installation of the modules, the Smartling modules related to translating your Drupal content. So there are basically three modules in the installation process that are pretty integral to the operation of the connector itself. That's the TMGMT module, the TMGMT Smartling module, and the TMGMT extension suite module. So these three modules enable us to basically allow you to submit content for translation from your Drupal environment into your Smartling project and get those translations back from Smartling into your Drupal environment. But alongside these modules are some core modules that Drupal comes installed with, that are pretty integral to the operation of our existing Smartling modules. And those core modules are the language module, the locale module, the content translation module, and the config translation module. Some customers I've worked with seem to think that these modules are interchangeable, optional. They can be disabled or enabled at will as needed, but that's not the case. We would definitely need all four of these core modules enabled in order for the Smartling connector to fully operate as expected, because these core modules are responsible for a lot of the UI elements in your Drupal environment that enable you to actually request content for translation and then see those translations in your environment. So it's a very important distinction to make. You want all of these modules installed and enabled in order to facilitate the translation process.
Nice. A quick question I would have is, so these are the ones that are required. What about customers that maybe are using custom or additional modules that they're creating content with? What would be kind of the rules that they would have to follow to make sure that they were able to translate content from those, or if there's strings in those, how would they get those translated?
Well, we have functionality for translating custom modules as well. It's part of a combination of what the work of the core modules and the Smartling modules do. We make it accessible in the UI in your Drupal environment, where you can access, select, and request the custom module strings for translation. So if there are any custom modules that need translation, as long as your team makes it accessible in any way that the connector can access the strings of that custom module, we would be able to request those strings for translation and translate them as needed.
Great. So I think that, yeah, that answers my question. Is making sure that so each of the modules that they're working with, they would, as long as the creator, the developer is internationalizing the strings properly to make it so that the Drupal module can pick it up and then we can process it basically. Okay.
Exactly.
That makes sense. All right, let's move forward here. I think the next thing we have is fields.
Yeah, so fields are where you determine what in your Drupal environment is in scope for translation. This is an important first step to take because this determines what actually will be translatable when you request the content for translation. So upon installing the necessary modules, you definitely want to go into this fields menu and check off any content types and content type fields that you wish to translate using the connector. Once you have checked off these fields, those fields will be included in the submissions made to Smartling, and they will be translated. Once you receive those contents back from Smartling to Drupal, those fields will be replaced with translated text. This is also a good way to determine what's out of scope. So if there's a certain content type that you wish to translate, but there's a field within that content type that you don't want to include for translation, you can avoid checking that field off and allowing the translation process to translate everything around that field, leaving that field excluded from the translation process. So this is definitely a good step to take when immediately upon first installing the modules, going in and defining what is translatable in your environment.
So it sounds like basically the person setting up the content types and the authors have the ability to really configure on a exact field level per content type what gets translated and what doesn't get translated. Do you feel like that's a lot for them to manage, or do you think there's mistakes made in that process, or how do you feel like that overall goes for customers? I
think it goes pretty well for customers. Most customers understand that this is a necessary step. They understand what they want to translate. They understand what needs to be done. And it's a very minor process to go in and say, this item needs to be translated. This item does not need to be translated. So I think it's a very low level effort in order to get a high value in this case. Yeah. And you only have to do it once per content type and per field. And it's really as you create new content types or new structures, you'd probably configure those
But the idea is, these content types are just templates, right? They're reused to create new, new nodes or entities or whatever they may be. And as you create them, you're reusing the same template over and over and over. So you're not having to go into each instance of the content and configure this. It's really on the content type template. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's 100% correct. This is a pretty much set it and forget it option. You set it, and then until you create something new that you haven't used before, you can pretty much forget it.
Nice. Okay, great. So let's move forward here. And we're going to talk about, I think, the plugin configuration options that are kind of key and important.
Right. So the Smartling connector comes with a variety of customizable configuration options that will change the way the connector actually works. The first option I think we should talk about here is the auto publishing option. By default, what Smartling will do is once you request a piece of content for translation from your Drupal environment, Smartling will translate it, send it back, and that Drupal job that initiated that process will automatically be basically approved and published on your CMS platform. Some customers decide or believe that to be kind of overstepping the boundaries of the translation process. They have a QA process in place, for example, and they want their team to go in and approve of a translation before publishing on their site. So what they would do is they would, disable the auto publishing feature. As you can see in the screenshot, there's an auto accept finished translations option at the very top. Disabling that option will make it so that once Smartling has completed translations, it will send those completed translations back to your Drupal environment, but it will not publish those translations till somebody on your team manually goes in and approves those translations. So that's something. Sure.
Yeah, so it's basically providing like the flexibility for both types of teams, right? So you have teams that maybe don't have the ability to review all the content and make sure it looks good before they publish it, but then you have a team that wants to be kind of control and make sure everything looks perfect before it goes out. So you have multiple options here to support those use cases, it sounds like.
Exactly. We've got options for days here. We can support any use case that your customers will come up with. Another configuration option that is important to note is the content parsing customizations. So we have the ability to customize what we call placeholders in content that has been submitted for translation. And what a placeholder is a piece of defined content that will not be accessible to translators. So for example, if there is a particular word in a sentence that you don't want translators to alter, you can make that particular word or item in a sentence a placeholder, and that will prevent translators from changing that particular bit of text.
So what are some real life use cases of where you'd want to, what kind of something you'd want to protect that's kind of middle of sentence like that?
Yeah, so there are definitely use cases where customers have, say, JavaScript code or Python code or some sort of scripting language in the middle of a sentence, basically a variable that they're using that's essential to the functionality of another part of their site. So any type of change of this type of variable will break the functionality of their site. Obviously, you don't want this to happen during the translation process. So what our customers will do is they'll make that variable a placeholder, preventing translators from changing it and thus breaking the functionality of their site.
Nice. Okay, that makes sense.
All right, so moving on to our next configuration option is the flexible automated scheduling. So the Smartling connector uses Drupal's cron interface in order to decide when to run its necessary executions. The idea is that every interval of scheduled time, Drupal will run its cron job. And that interval of time is customizable to an hour's time. So what happens is every time this cron is scheduled to run, the Smartling connector will perform 3 actions. It will push out any content that you've requested for translation from Drupal into your Smartling project. It will pull in any completed translations in your Smartling project into your Drupal environment. And it will also push out any requested items that you've submitted for translation in terms of context out to your Smartling project. So every time the cron runs, it does all 3 of these actions over and over again as per the interval of time you've defined in the cron job settings.
So as a marketing team, if you wanted to set it up where you didn't have to have a user go in and actually select which content, is new, right? Tracking which content is new, packaging it up and sending it for translation. You could, for example, just turn on this automation maybe to happen once a week or once every 2 weeks, or maybe more frequently if you want. But it would then go and basically, one, check for any kind of new content or updated change content, package that up into a new job and submit it. And then it would go through the translation process. At the same time, it looks for any content that's already finished or completed and initiates the download and checking that and publishing that, as well as the context piece I think you mentioned, right?
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And one of the things that you can configure to make that process even quicker is implementing what we call HTTP callbacks for instant translation delivery. So one of the items that the cron job is responsible for is downloading your completed translations. If you were to incorporate an HTTP callback, what will happen is once your translations are completed in Smartling, your translated content will be delivered immediately. No need to wait for the cron job to run. No need to manually process it. It will automatically send your completed translations directly to your Drupal environment. No fuss, no muss.
So the Smartling system basically sends an HTTP notification to the Drupal environment to say, hey, I have a finished translation, job. Here's the package that you need to download and check into your system. So then the module receives that notification, could then go and retrieve the finished translation and handle it appropriately. That way you're not waiting. I see. So that you could potentially lower, you could improve performance because of this cron's not running on a frequent basis, checking both systems and having to do all that. So the callback makes it more interactive.
Right, exactly. Using the callback lowers the amount of items in the cron's queue, and a lower amount of items in the queue means a lower amount of executionables. Lower executables means better performance.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, wonderful. Let's move forward. I think let's go into paragraphs here. So go ahead.
Right. Paragraphs. So paragraphs are basically customized, well, not customizable, an optional module in the Drupal environment that allows you to create what's called a paragraph type. It's a new entity type that you can add to parent entities that will allow you to include what we are calling paragraphs. So what is a paragraph? It's basically a customizable container that contains basically what's a template for an amount of content, a specific pattern of content that you can reuse across your website as needed, where it's needed. And some customers that I've encountered, they actually compose their entire website utilizing these paragraphs that they've created from scratch. So paragraphs are a pretty customizable, powerful feature, especially for developers that want to simplify the content creation process for their content authors and creating a pattern of structure of content that they create and reuse and put in places as needed throughout the Drupal site.
Nice, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. And I think here we have a screenshot of a paragraph setup. So I think you want to walk us through that?
Yeah, there's not much to walk through here because the paragraph setup this is just an example of what a paragraph would look like if one were to create it this way. But the idea is that the paragraph is a set of fields that are customizable. You can add or remove fields in your paragraph template or paragraph type as needed, and they can be duplicated throughout all the parts of the site that you want to create these paragraph types.
Okay, so I think some things we wanted to talk about in general with paragraphs is, the fields need to be all enabled to be, in scope fields need to be enabled for translation. We often see customers that will create these paragraphs and they'll maybe leave a couple of fields off for enablement, and then they won't get certain parts of the site translated. And so that causes, them to be having to go back, enable those, resend those for translation and go through the translation process to make up the difference. So one thing we want to consider is proper configuration and setup. And then also these fields can be nested, so they can be quite complex. So just having someone that understands, how you set up these fields, and then that they're configured correctly, and that the nesting is handled, when translation is completed, that all the nesting is handled and preserved properly. Again, I think, Donovan, you slightly mentioned this, but paragraphs on parent entities are not the same as this paragraph modules. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so paragraphs on parent entities, there's basically a field type called a paragraph field type. And what customers will assume is that if they enable this field type for translation, they're essentially translating any paragraphs that's associated with this parent entity, like a node or an entity or a taxonomy of some sort. But that's not the case. That would not result in translating your paragraph. What you need to do instead is to enable the translation of the fields within the paragraph itself. That will enable the translation of the contents of the paragraph, as opposed to trying to enable translation on the parent entity itself. So that's a very, very tricky and very, very important distinction to make if you're utilizing paragraphs that you hope to translate in your Drupal environment.
Nice. Thank you for the call out there on that.
No worries.
Okay, so back to me now for a minute. So I'm going to talk a little bit about visual context. And visual context for us is really allowing the linguist that's performing the translation the ability to see what the context, or what the original context of the strings look like. So when we get the content from Drupal, it's all in like an XML file, and in the XML file, it's all broken up into elements and things, and we have to parse through that, and we build these strings. Well, by default, you don't really have any context with those strings, so it's hard to understand, well, men's shoes, what does that really mean? What does it look like? And from language to language, context is harder and harder. So what we have done is implemented automated visual context that gets delivered. So when somebody requests translation for a paragraph or a page or whatever it may be inside of Drupal, we'll attach, we'll also upload a visual context, a rendering of this, and it can be an HTML rendering, but it allows the linguist to see the original site and what it looks like as they before they start translating. As they translate, they will also be able to see their translations rendered in a live format, so they can actually see how if they run off the screen, if there's issues there, they can potentially get ahead of those types of problems. So that's really what we implement. We try to hook this up for all of our connectors. The biggest thing here is it's going to drive, what we found is it drove quality up 30% on average, 30% quality increase by actually using a visual context. So a key important thing here to reduce kind of turnaround times and manual efforts. Another popular way that this is used is a lot of companies will do it, that we work with will have their own internal review processes where they use their subject matter experts. And if they found it's hard for them to take screenshots and then take these screenshots and put them in an Excel file and write what translations they want changed, what's the original one, what's the new one, and then try to track this and get it all done. Well, instead of doing all of that, we can actually use we can bring them into our platform, show them visual context, allow them to quickly go through the site, make the changes they want, get their feedback incorporated before it ever gets published and goes live. Really eliminates their manual work that goes around trying to get other people, that's not really their main job, to review translations. It makes it a little easier for them to manage. Any comments from you on that, Dimitri? Sorry, Donovan?
Yeah, no real comments. I just think it's a very important thing to have visual context set up and be utilizing it when translating a Drupal site. It's just the best way to get the best bang for your buck when it comes to translations.
And would you say most of our customers that you've worked with, do they have this deployed? Do they use this heavily, or?
Yes, absolutely. I think the majority of my customers who use the Drupal connector also are using visual context. So yes.
Nice. Okay, let's keep moving forward here. I know that was, we're getting towards the end of the presentation here. The next thing is around change management. And what we mean by this is, as you're translating and you're requesting translations, maybe you kind of, the first thing you do is start with a big set of content. Like you're going to do, it's your first time translating, you're going to send everything that really you want to translate all in one big batch. And then you're going to translate that. But then what happens is there's this constant change in your content that's already been translated. Well, now, once you start modifying the source language and changing and adapting it to generate new business and engage new users, well, you need new translations so that your languages stay in sync with the English message. or at least they're captivating, right? They have a chance to be more captivating and stay in sync. Well, when you're translating in lots of languages and with lots of content and lots of authors, the change management is really cumbersome, especially if you're doing it manually. So our automated, change management allows us to auto detect when content has been modified that was already sent for translation. We can then do a couple of different things. We can, and this is the flexible part of it, is we can automatically send that for translation into a new job on a frequent, on some sort of basis that you want, whether that's once a day, once a week. These cron jobs that we can set up as well will automatically basically create new jobs of changed content so that the user doesn't have to think about it. This is a way you can really kind of leave it and forget it, and then it allows you to keep in sync with your changes and not really have to think about them. The other format is not every customer wants to be extremely agile when it comes to translation. And there's various reasons why that may be. One of the main reasons maybe it can be expensive to translate all of the content that you're constantly changing. Maybe not all of it has the same value. Maybe you don't need to keep up with all the changes. They generate quite a bit of cost to keep up with. So we can, our detection can detect it and decide not to send it automatically, but instead it can just tell you that it's ready for translation. And then you can decide when you actually go in, package that up and send it off for translation. So flexibility around how you handle your changes and keep up with them is important here. So last thing I wanted to talk about was one of our biggest Drupal customer we talk about frequently here is before Smartling, they were, trying to translate into 35 languages, right? And they were working, a new piece of content or a new release was on average 4+ days to turn around. And that was with lots of developers really forcing it, manual effort to try to get it to go through, trying to keep up with all of these constant changes. Everything was just really cumbersome. With Smartling, after deploying with Smartling, we were able to reduce the amount of the turnaround time from 0 to 2 days. So dramatic improvements in speed of how quickly the translation gets done. And we reduced the developers to no developers. All of the work's now being done through the software. So this is how we actually have helped not just this customer, but many of other customers scale their localization processes into 35, and in some ways even more languages than that. Donovan, do you have anything you want to add about the Drupal? Any customers maybe you want to bring up or mention?
No customers come to mind. I just know that every Drupal customer that I've worked with is very happy with the connector and very happy with what it has brought to their workflow in the way that it's lessened the amount of things they have to keep track of.
Nice, thank you. All right, so I think we're about done. I think we got some questions here that we are going to go ahead and read off. Let's see here. Okay, so Donovan, you want to go ahead and answer the questions? I'll read them off for you.
Sure.
It says, does the connector work well for a headless Drupal architecture?
Right. So the Drupal connector is basically concerned with your actual content. Where that content lives isn't exactly important. Whether it's headless or not isn't super important. But something to keep in mind is that since the headless connector, the headless Drupal instance is divorced from the theme content, you would need to find a way to facilitate capturing visual context in that case. Yeah, you would need to capture visual context using one of our visual context solutions, as having the CMS be headless means that the visual aspects are divorced from the actual content.
That makes sense. Okay, so basically we can support headless Drupal. You're saying that the visual context may be not as elegant as the native solution, but it's still a way of actually accomplishing it using one of our other capturing tools, basically.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. All right. Second question is, what if my Drupal theme contains strings that I need to translate? How do I handle that?
Yeah, so that's pretty easy to handle. So the way the Drupal connector works is that we give you pretty much all of the strings within your Drupal environment as options for being able to be requested for translation. That includes, strings in your UI, strings in your fields, as in your field names or your content names, the actual content itself, such as nodes, entities, taxonomies. Pretty much every type of string you can think of in your Drupal environment is selectable and requestable for translation. And these options include these strings in your Drupal theme. So using our robust request translations functionality, you can select these Drupal theme strings for translation as well.
Gotcha. That's great. So they're able to basically keep up with these themes, and if they're internationalized properly.
Right, exactly.
Good. Okay, last question, and then I think we've got to finish up here. After translations are published, we often need to make corrections to the translations. This requires lots of screenshots and spreadsheets to manage. Is it easier with the connector? And I think I answered this a little bit earlier, but you can elaborate on that too if you want, Donovan.
Yeah, I can elaborate by saying that's where Smartling comes in. You can edit the translations directly in your Smartling environment and just use those translations there. In editing these translations, we'll add them to your translation memory, update your translation memory as needed. And anytime these strings come through in any future content, these edits would be included in that content as well. Great.
So I think that's all the questions we have for all the time we have really for the presentation. Thank you, Donovan, for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to speak about all this Drupal stuff with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. My first presentation in the bag. So
yeah. Your first DrupalCon, yay.
Yay.
Well, thank you all for joining us, and everybody have a good DrupalCon. It was great to be with you guys today.
Yeah, thanks guys.